some people who probably aren't familiar with Noam Chomsky, just a little bit of background. He's currently the most cited living author on the planet, according to an article by MIT Tech Talk. And of all authors ever, including the Bible and Shakespeare and Freud, Chomsky, last I saw, was ranked 8th. My first introduction to Noam's work was at CSU, Colorado State, where I saw him give a talk about Latin America about 25 years ago. And it was honestly kind of devastating. So thank you, John. I appreciate that. Yeah, some of Chomsky's work can be difficult to read and hard to read. But as I was mentioning to Robert, it's led me to networking with people who, the corporate media doesn't represent fairly. People in Venezuela and Cuba and poor people and working people. And just in a lot of ways, he's, it's been an interesting growing experience learning Chomsky's work. And to find his biographer, Robert Barsky, has been a joy. Robert is a activist scholar in his own right. He's done a lot of work on the rights of refugees. His biography of Chomsky, I think, is very fascinating. And to learn the roots of, who mentored Chomsky, where did Chomsky learn some of his ideas and philosophy? Learning about people like Rudolf Rocker and Zelig Harris has been, and Emma Goldman has been interesting as well. So when I first approached Bob about talking, first it was going to be about Chomsky, then it was going to be about the environment, because I'm involved with the environmental group here. And then this church has become to consider being a sanctuary church. Kudos to First Unitarian and the Unitarians around the country who are doing good social justice work. Chomsky's actually spoken at many Unitarian churches along the way. So since we're considering sanctuary, I wanted to tap into Robert's expertise on refugee rights and immigrant rights as well. And Bob's forthcoming book is called Asocial Injustice, documenting the experience of being undocumented in America. So Robert and I agreed that he's going to just kind of bring a lot of these threads together. And he'll talk for about, 50 minutes or whatever he feels like, maybe half hour. We'll kind of play it by ear, and then I'd be delighted, and he'd be delighted to take questions and just have a conversation about this kind of this movement of consciousness that I think Chomsky has been a big part of. And another person who influenced Chomsky is a philosopher named John Dewey, who said democracy begins in conversation. So I look forward to Robert's presentation and towards him engaging you all afterwards. And also in the community room, I have a lot of Noam Chomsky books for free. I mean, if you want to make a donation, it will be going to the church. And so please take a book. I kind of need to make some room on my kitchen shelves. So from Nashville, Tennessee, where Robert teaches at Vanderbilt University, comparative literature, Jewish studies, French. I know I'm leaving a couple of other things out, but most importantly to me, he's become a friend of mine. And so please join me in welcoming Robert Barsky.
All right, well, I can't tell you what an honor and a pleasure it is to be here. My wife lived in Boulder, Colorado, and as a skier, I was very excited to come out a few years ago, but I didn't have the chance to connect with the communities here, which are so strong and so powerful and so inspiring for so many people. So it's a very special pleasure for me to be here and to be amongst you in this incredibly beautiful place. It is also a very special pleasure to get to know Preston. He's a rare and exciting person, and we've had correspondence by mail. We've had kind of an 18th century correspondence so far, and I'm very thrilled to finally meet him so that we can expand this a little bit further. So thank you for having me. I'm sorry to say that on this very, very beautiful day in the kind of springtime of Denver, that the news I will bring will be mostly bad. And I will be speaking about things that I find to be heart-wrenching and gut-wrenching and so forth relating to undocumented people. And I will do so with reference to Noam Chomsky in some ways because Noam Chomsky has been so important to me for so many years. My first contacts with him, which go back to the 80s, were related to convention refugees in Canada, and also related to the history of anarchist movements in Montreal, and also related to language studies. So it was on account of another 18th century relationship, which was letter writing for years and years, that I landed up being asked to write what was originally just a small biography of him. And I was interested in particular about his milieus, the people who had inspired him, both historically and in terms of activist communities and so forth. So the book was originally called Noam Chomsky's Milieus. So those people who had been, for him, formative. As you know, many people accuse him of being just out there and not, there's one right-wing commentator who said that he came from an egg somewhere, that it was just so out of the context, but that's nuts. He has a long lineage of philosophers and writers and thinkers and activists and artists who've inspired him, so I was excited to connect to them. So in the background, therefore, behind this discussion today of undocumented people, Noam will be very present, and I will mention him a few times as regards his discussions of borders. The work to which I'm referring is, as Preston said, relating to this new book called A Social Injustice. And it is indeed asocial, and it is a tremendous injustice that's occurring as regards these 15 or so million people, undocumented people in America. And in response to my concern for the plight of this group, I started doing interviews in prisons and with lawyers, public defenders, doctors, police officers, border guards, NGO activists, and so forth, mostly in the South, who were involved with immigrant rights, and did so for a period of around 8 or 9 years. And my conclusion is the same, as it turns out, as the conclusion that I had in the couple of books that I wrote about convention refugees, which is that we can't really put band-aids on this issue. And the proposal that I'm going to put forward to you today will be that the only solution to this problem is open borders between here and Mexico, open borders eventually through the Americas, open borders eventually through this world of ours. The amount of suffering that's imposed by nations and by borders is dramatic. And I want to try and make the case today for open borders, both historically and in terms of just the rationality of trying to help these people. I've put together a somewhat formal talk for about 20 or 25 minutes, if that's okay. And then we can chat afterwards. As you can imagine, being out in the community and speaking with undocumented people and people who are defending them, the wealth of knowledge that they bring is astonishing, and I would be very happy to tell you a little bit about some of these issues, and certainly talk a little bit about what it would mean for this community to be involved in this work. So I want to begin by reminding us that on June 27th, 2013, the U.S. Senate passed the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act. And on July the 3rd, the Congressional Budget Office and the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation reviewed its impact on a range of levels related primarily to the U.S. budget. The review found that had it passed the House, the act would have changed how certain non-citizens who are currently unlawfully present in the U.S. would become eligible for Social Security and Medicare benefits. From a pecuniary standpoint, it would have led to the appropriation of $46.3 billion for expenses relating to the security of the southern U.S. border and initial administrative costs, as well as $1.5 billion for an employment program for youth. It would have prohibited certain unauthorized work from counting towards eligibility for Social Security and Medicare benefits, and it would have resulted in fewer unauthorized residents in the country than is currently projected. That reduction in the population would, according to the predictions outlined in this report, reduce the taxes paid by or on behalf of unauthorized residents by $3.2 billion over the 2014 to 2023 period. The review also predicted reducing the inflow of undocumented immigrants by about 1/3, or right up to 1/2, but would also generate a 10 million person increase in the US population, and these changes would result in a decrease in federal budget deficits of around $685 billion over the period leading up to 2024. The reception of this information by the US population was driven by a broad range of media representations of the bill, with the usual suspects lining up on either side of the debate. The defectors on either side, that is, Republicans who supported the bill and Democrats who opposed it, reflects a political landscape that is increasingly crowded with Latino voters, particularly in certain regions of the country. But the schism is also tied to historical arguments made by nativists, trade union activists, and the English-only type and the more xenophobic voters, variously presented in different regions of the country. Surprisingly, at least from my perspective, was the dearth of information regarding the life that is being imposed upon a group of people who represent 5% of the total US population, equivalent to the totality of Asian Americans in this country, or the effect that this new law would have on them and their families both in the US and back home. A further surprise, but maybe not, is that virtually nobody from the so-called liberal right up to the so-called conservative end of the spectrum suggested alleviating this problem by opening up the border between the US and Mexico as a possible first step towards eliminating borders in the Americas, including, of course, the northern border between Canada and the US. I want to address these lacunae today with you by promoting and discussing ideas of eliminating the dysfunctional borders we so cherish and seek to reinforce by pitting them against a much broader discussion about the experiences of undocumented people. Unlike the current plan to legalize the existing undocumented population and then enforce stronger border controls, open borders actually addresses the underlying issues while remaining consistent with such objectives as promoting free trade and reducing unemployment in this country. In addition, I wish to investigate how undocumented people are represented through discourse, with reference to the obstacles and challenges that relate to the translation of their experience from their native language into English. Translation, interpretation, and border crossings are profoundly intertwined. And if we ever hope to truly address the complex issues relating to the movement of people, we have to consider how this experience is translated across linguistic, historical, and cultural contextual divides, and then misinterpreted in so many cases to the American people. And if we ever hope to actually address the problem of migration across our borders, we have to truly address what it means to undertake what is an increasingly arbitrary and unworkable system of adjudicating and managing our borders as though people who cross them should be treated like dirt or matter of out of place, as they currently are, and that's a reference to Henry James. If we are to truly face these concerns, it is my belief that the option of opening up our borders will seem not just logical, but doable. Not just less repressive, but also beneficial to all parties concerned. In fact, this idea of opening up the borders is perhaps itself the real concern, because it begs the question of how legitimate state borders are in the first place. And here we can bring in the words of Noam Chomsky. And I should tell you that I encountered the question of borders originally because I, by accident, became a transcriber for convention refugee hearings. I say by accident because I was hired as a typist. Somebody knew that this used to be a skill. It apparently is no longer a skill. Everybody knows how to type now, but it used to be a skill, and I learned it in high school and had developed a relatively high level of proficiency. And when I was desperate to be able to pay my rent while I was writing a master's thesis on Lord Byron, some of my friends had heard about this place that was hiring people as typists. So I went to this place and started, I sat down in front of this thing that I'd never heard of before, which was a computer, and I was connected at my feet to something else I'd never heard of before, which was called a transcription machine with pedals. And I was just told to type whatever I heard. And what I heard was the following inquiry is based on the Canada Immigration Act, and then went on from there. And it turned out to be the stories that people tell to customs officials when they arrive in the country in order to claim convention refugee status. And the stories that are told were at that time adjudicated by judges who would read the case and then decide up or down as to whether or not the person was a legitimate convention refugee. So my job, I was kind of the intermediary between the refugee's body, as it were, and the eyes of the judges in Ottawa. And I was an intermediary in terms of typing. When it became clear how much suffering convention refugees go through because they have fled their country claiming persecution, and the persecution in convention cases tends to be very dramatic, usually involving torture, this job became, at some level, an unimaginable nightmare, but at some other level, incredibly eye-opening, because I was being privy to what goes on in other countries and being privy to this process that we have to help people who are suffering in countries under the convention. Anyhow, it led to me to writing a manifesto that I then gave to the Canadian Broadcasting Company Corporation, the CBC, and this became a gigantic news story that the ways in which the transcription process was being done without any safety whatsoever in terms of protecting the words of these people on the one hand, but also the government was at that time trying to crack down on convention refugees, and I knew from the stories being told that the stories that they were telling to the Canadian public were not true. So it landed up becoming the subject of my PhD work, and then the subject of my first book, and it has affected me in all sorts of ways. But I was trying to find somebody who would talk about this stuff in ways that made some kind of sense, and that was one of the ways in which I encountered Noam Chomsky. And in particular, one of the quotes that I found in an interview that he had done about borders, talking about the illegitimacy of borders. It was one of these moments I guess everybody in this room has probably had, where, like, first of all, somebody actually agrees with the conclusions that I've come to, and this somebody is powerful and is a great authority, and it's as though he gave me license to think what I was thinking, and that to me has been a very inspiring moment. So I'm going to give you one of those quotes. He says, and this is much more recent than the quote that I read, but it's the same gist, and that's, of course, what I'm most interested in Noam's work is the attitudes. He writes, "The legitimacy of borders, of states for that matter, is at best conditional and temporary. Almost all borders have been imposed and maintained by violence and are quite arbitrary. The Lebanon-Israel border was established a century ago by the Sykes-Picot Agreement, dividing up the former Ottoman Empire in the interest of British and French imperial power, with no concern for the people who happen to live there, or even for the terrain. The border makes no sense, which is why it was so easy to cross unwittingly. Surveying the terrible conflicts in the world, it's clear that almost all are the residue of imperial crimes and the borders that the great powers drew in their own interests." In addressing these issues from what is arguably a more radical perspective than is usually done, and here I'm talking both about what Noam said and also what I'm going to claim here, I am not considering some unachievable utopian or dystopian vision, but rather I am proposing a more thorough evaluation of the current situation regarding immigration, illegal and otherwise, as well as the social and also financial consequences of a deeply punitive system of incarceration, deportation, and marginalization of our vast undocumented population. A relevant historical precedent for our purposes was established by the European Parliament and Council Directive 2004/38 that allows citizens of the European Union member states to freely relocate and work across the broad spectrum of EU countries, and has done so without a massive increase in relocations, a significant rise in crime as a consequence of that, or a diluting of the national character of member states. Most people have a knee-jerk reaction to the idea of dismantling borders between states as different as Canada, the US, and Mexico. But how shocking is this idea really when compared to today's free movement between Germany and France, or Italy and Romania, or Ireland and the UK, considering the history of the 20th century? Chomsky recalls the following. Chomsky says, "Some borders are eroding along with the usual cruel hatreds and conflicts they symbolize and inspire. The most dramatic case is Europe. For centuries, Europe was the most savage region in the world, torn by hideous and destructive wars. Europe developed the technology and the culture of war that enabled it to conquer the world. After a final burst of indescribable savagery, the mutual destruction ceased at the end of World War II. Scholars attribute that outcome to the thesis of democratic peace, that one democracy hesitates to war against another. But Europeans may have also understood that they had developed such capacities for destruction that the next time they played their favorite game, it would be the last time. The closer integration that has developed since then is not without serious problems, but it's certainly a vast improvement over what came before. And that's going to be very important to the argument I'm making here too. I'm not claiming that we're going to solve all the problems of the world, but it's going to be a vast improvement. It's ironic, I think, that we have that Americans would have or would feign more concern about borders than, say, Europeans, given how vast ours are. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the length of the international boundary line of the U.S.-Canada border, excluding Alaska, is 3,987 miles. The length of the U.S.-Mexico border is estimated at 1,933 miles. The length of the Alaska-Canada border is another 1,583 miles. The fact is, most of these borders honestly cannot really be controlled, and efforts in this direction, like walls and tracking devices, are enormously expensive and enormously cost inefficient. Furthermore, this entire tracking system that comes to favor the wealthy border crossers who have access to Nexus, GOES, and other costly systems is manifest. It will, of course, be argued that the EU, certainly people argue this more recently, that the EU system has proven a failure in light of recent news about the euro and delinquent countries like Portugal, Greece, and Cyprus. In fact, I think that this is hardly attributable to the opening up of the borders, and indeed the situation would likely be worse without the EU, and that it can be revised to the advantage of member states on the basis of what the euro crisis has taught us. The anti-immigrant, patriotic, and English-only hype also ignores early ideals of a range of historical figures, including the Indian poet Tagore, Confucianism, the Islamic concept of the Ummah, and the early ideas of world empire touted by Alexander the Great, or universal morality upheld in Greek Stoicism. More recently, we can reference the ideal of world citizenship described by Erasmus and Kant, and a host of those people now invoked to denounce free movement or free trade, people who in their lifetimes often touted both as part of their credo, advocating freedom and promoting happiness. Thomas Jefferson, in his instructions to Virginia delegates to the 1774 Continental Congress, declared that, quote, "Nature has given to all men a right of departing from one country in which chance and not choice has placed them, and of going in quest of new habitations and of their establishing new societies under such laws and regulations as to them shall seem most likely to promote happiness." And Chomsky, recalling Adam Smith's advocacy for free trade, notes that, quote, "I agree with Adam Smith that free movement of people is a core component of free trade. As for free movement of capital, that's a totally different matter. Unlike persons of flesh and blood, capital has no rights, at least by Enlightenment or classical liberal standards," end quote. And not to mention, of course, Articles 12 and 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which serves as the very basis of most international conventions to which we are signatories. So this is the 1948 convention, and that stands behind the convention to which I was referring to previously, the Convention for the Rights of Refugees. By invoking the European Union and recalling the likes of Adam Smith, who we consider the touchstone for capitalism, or Thomas Jefferson, the bedrock of American foundational thinking, I aim to demystify and validate the possibility of at least imagining a so-called cosmopolitan world, a world without national borders, and proposing this solution as a legitimate and all-encompassing approach to the abhorrent situation we're now tolerating. And in recalling the basic precepts of this Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act, the one before Congress, that includes such ideas as doubling the number of border officials charged with securing the U.S.-Mexican border in the modest hope of a decline in numbers of newly arrived undocumented people, I'd also like to note that even the passage of substantial immigration reform will not address the underlying question of enforcing or legitimizing our borders, and will not significantly change how undocumented immigrants will be treated in the future beyond the larger border guard presence. But let's take a step back for a moment and consider what the current system looks like from the perspective of the undocumented immigrant, and then examine by extension what it will mean to prolong this system of push and pull factors amidst a mechanism of imprisonment and deportation as proposed by the pragmatic, or dare I say, cynical political parties in search of votes for forthcoming elections from increasingly powerful Hispanic voters. In thinking about how people experience illegality in the US, I'm drawn to invoking some previous political catchwords like family values, remember that one? And ideas of our founding fathers, or ideals of international law, because in so doing we find a common set of criteria that most people on a rather broad political range will find spaces for agreement in. For example, we valorize keeping families together. We look for ways to facilitate the active participation of both parents in the lives of their children. We advocate for diverse educational possibilities for parents and children, and we aspire to finding common ground for all citizens to ensure civic pride and participation to help build and support our nation. Each one of these fundamental values is undermined by our current treatment of undocumented people. And each one would continue to be undermined even if this act were to pass the House in its current form, which, as we know, it will not. The basic tenets of our current practices that undermine these values are numerous, so I want to focus on just a few. First, in the current system, there's the fickle and unpredictable ways in which the broad array of regulations and laws relating to undocumented people are applied. This is perhaps the most marked characteristic of how we treat undocumented immigrants, and it points to the vast spectrum of possible interactions that undocumented people can have with authorities. Given their gigantic numbers, it's clear that the most common interaction between citizens or authorities from the host country and undocumented people is benign. That is, in most cases, people just go about their business and leisure without questioning the legal status of immigrants that they encounter. On the other hand, undocumented people can, at any moment, find themselves questioned, arrested, set up for deportation, because they live in a state of constant illegality. Any contact with authority might be their last. The most innocuous traffic violation can cost these people their freedom. And if they have been previously deported, they can be set up for years of mandatory prison time for having re-entered the country. Second, there's the draconian ways in which we punish, sentence, and deport people for relatively minor infractions that for the most part are overlooked for people like ourselves. This 8-year study of undocumented people that I undertook in the US, that's in a sense still ongoing, in the course of that research, I interviewed a range of public defenders who described their in-depth experience in the system. One such public defender, who's now a lawyer, summed up the situation as follows, quote, "These are folks who to a large extent came here for the sole reason of earning enough money to send to their mothers." He's a very, very funny guy, and I have to tell you, there's going to be a few quotes from him. Some of it's going to be, as you'll hear, he finds a way of personalizing these stories. The sole reason they came here was to earn enough money to send to their mothers. And they're doing just that. And then, on Friday night, they're there with a car. They would never have a car where they came from. $500 gets you a damn good usable car here, and you couldn't touch one for $500 in Mexico. And they can drive it. License? Maybe. Then some clown shows up drunk one night and sells one of the guys a $200 pistol. There's a really big tradition in Latin America where if something is happening that's good, and then you fire your pistol off. This guy's not a threat to the community. We take away the pistol, we tell him in this country we don't do that, and we go on our way. Because the reason that they are in jail is the same reason why my Caucasian clients are in jail. Drinking, drugging, and being stupid. And just because you come from Mexico and are here to send money home to your mother doesn't alleviate any of these conditions. But what eventually happens to them if arrested depends on who's working in the jail as to whether, when they're looked up in the computer, there's a little line in the computer that says, hold for ICE. And if there's that little line in the computer, they are screwed. Third, there's no discussion of how the relative advantages of US citizens receiving status to work and live in Mexico. How many Americans, young and old, would seize on the opportunity to work as a lifeguard in Cancun, a guide in the mountains of Puebla, or a journalist in Mexico City? And given the gigantic industrial zone in the Maquiladora region of northern Mexico, periodic downturns in the US industrial labor opportunities could be turned into brief or sustained periods of employment in Mexico. Fourth, there's no acknowledgement that the current system actually traps immigrants in this country. Given the fickleness of how our authorities apply immigration law, many undocumented immigrants are or feel, and I should say that in this realm, are and feel are the same thing. If you are trapped or if you feel trapped, it's the same thing, really, in terms of how one acts. How many undocumented immigrants feel trapped, terrified of returning home because of their fear that they will be captured en route and then arrested and deported. A smooth movement of Mexicans and Americans across our borders would create a kind of mobile workforce that benefits industries on both sides of the border, and by enforcing strong pollution, labor, and safety standards as part of that negotiation, we could work to overcome some of the negative implications of offshore manufacturing, while logically preventing it as the labor markets become more flexible through the Americas. Furthermore, with the misinformation about gaining status in the US, many temporary workers choose to stay or come in illegally in the first place rather than following channels designed for temporary workers. Opening the borders between our two countries, say, again, between here and Mexico, but eventually through the Americas, would eliminate the need to designate the time workers can spend here or the time that our workers can spend in, say, Mexico, thus allowing more flexibility in the workplaces of, say, Volkswagen, that has a major assembly plant in Chattanooga and yet another one in Puebla, Mexico. Fifth, in all the cost analyses that I quoted at the beginning of this talk, there's no mention of the gigantic, huge pecuniary implications of continuing to track, arrest, incarcerate, and deport illegal immigrants. That would, and all of these things would continue even under this proposed legislation. Private prison companies, such as CCA based in Nashville, are lobbying to secure contracts for the incarceration of undocumented people, which assures high costs, long prison terms, and a perpetual industry of lobbying for the counterproductive idea of being tough on crime. Sixth, There's no discussion of the merits of the U.S. becoming a bi- or trilingual country, officially. With a smooth flow of people across the border, Americans might be enticed to learn Spanish, to explore Latin America, and to enjoy the incredibly diverse culture that Latin America has to offer, just as Latin Americans would enjoy the same privileges chez nous. Here I'm invoking my own home country of Quebec, and I can tell you that to learn French and go to Quebec is one of the great pleasures of the planet, and again, perhaps something that we can advocate as we think about dismantling these borders. Seventh, in all these discussions, there's no nod to business, who would undoubtedly celebrate the elimination of time-consuming and wasteful border procedures. Imagine the waste and pollution caused by the long and unnecessary bottlenecks of idling trucks filled with goods that are caught in the quagmire of customs lineups as drivers, paid by the hour or by the load, waste their time and energy. And of course, you've seen this in crossing into Mexico. You can see it also crossing into Canada. You always are sitting there thinking, I just don't get it. And finally, what does it say about the U.S. when our corporations entice talented Latin American laborers to work, discussing every year the possibility of legalizing undocumented migrants, but then at the same time support random, regular crackdowns that target those very people who slaughter our poultry, make our beds, weed our gardens, build our buildings? It's clear that not only do we need this population as active participants in our workforce, but the Congressional Budget Office itself demonstrates that it's actually financially sound to regularize their situations as a means of reducing our fixed costs, paying taxes for wages they are already earning, and paying into the Social Security that Americans rely upon for their autumn years. The crackdowns on undocumented people tear apart families, orphan children, including children who, having been born in the U.S. of undocumented parents, are lawful U.S. citizens, and undermines the work that undocumented immigrants perform in their quest to follow the American dream. The potential unleashed by open border regularization of their situations would make us, in fact, all the richer, whereas the reality of current practices reveals instead an underbelly as despicable as a kind of modern-day indentured labor with the constant threat of unnecessary hard time. Thank you.